Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So today, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, the information domain has manifested itself as one of the preeminent theaters of conflict in this war. But how Russia and Ukraine have approached this theater is a study in contrasts. The Ukrainian government has employed a robust information strategy from the highest levels of political leadership to its troops on the front lines in sharing messages and images that support their narrative and sharing them across the widest number of platforms available. Russia, on the other hand, has progressively shut down the information outlets available to its people. And those outlets it has not directly shut down have often have removed their services on their own volition to protest Russia's aggression. So today we welcome Mr. Thomas Kent to help us understand the Russian side of this equation and what those outside Russia can do to push in the information that the government is denying its own citizens. Mr. Kent is a specialist on disinformation, Russian media, and journalistic ethics. Until 2018, he was president and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a congressionally funded corporation providing news in 25 languages to the former Soviet Union, the Balkans, Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. He consults for governments, NGOs, and corporations on Russia, disinformation, and ethical journalism. His book on combating Russian disinformation in Europe, Africa, and Latin America was published in September 2021. Previously, Mr. Kent was standards editor of the Associated Press, responsible for credibility, fairness, and balance in AP's text, photo, and video services worldwide. He's also served with the AP as a reporter in Sydney, Australia, NATO and the European Union reporter in Brussels, reporter and bureau chief in Moscow, chief of AP operations in Tehran during the Iranian Revolution, deputy news editor and news editor of AP's World Service Division in New York, and international editor of the AP and chief of the AP supervisory desk. He lectures internationally on journalistic ethics and disinformation, has served twice as a juror for the Pulitzer Prizes in international reporting, and is a member of the advisory board of the Ethical Journalism Network. He's a senior fellow of the Jamestown Foundation and an associate fellow of GlobeSec in Slovakia. And I should also add that part of how we got in touch with him for today's presentation is his affiliation with the Marine Corps Cyber Auxiliary. So, sir, thank you very much for joining us today. And
thank you.
And so as we were just discussing earlier here, before we get into the subject matter of Russia and information available to its public, if you could maybe describe a little bit your role in the Cyber Auxiliary, as well as sort of the mission and resources that the Cyber Auxiliary makes available.
Yes, hi. The Cyber Auxiliary is a volunteer organization, and it consists of people who are active in their daily life in either cyber activities, offensive or defensive, or who are involved, as I am, in the cognitive domain, trying to get messages in or out of different places, thinking about what messages resound best in different environments. It's a group that has trained Marines in different places. I was at Camp Lejeune a few months ago, training some PSYOP and cyber forces there, and we do everything we can to share what expertise we have, either in cognitive or pretty hardcore cyber electronic work.
All right, great, thank you. And I'll also make a note to the audience that Mr. Kent is the first of a few Cyber Auxiliary representatives that we're going to have available on the Brutecast. So if you want to learn more about this organization or reach any of the individuals that we're going to be hosting here in the coming weeks, please feel free to reach out to the Krulak Center and we will connect you with those experts. So, sir, if we want to turn over now to the matter at hand in terms of how Russia has approached the information domain with its own people, and especially how it has started sort of clipping what's available to them.
Sure. Indeed, these days I work on disinformation and propaganda issues involving Russia, both Russia's external propaganda directed at other countries and its internal propaganda aimed at its own people. And the problem set I'm working on right now is the Russian internal information space, how the Putin regime is trying to control what its people see and think about the invasion of Ukraine and what we should do about that, if we should do something about that. I personally think we should do a lot about that. Putin has been preparing his internal battle space for years. Over the past decade, he has sharply limited freedom of speech within Russia. He shut down quite a number of independent media outlets. He's harassed foreign broadcasters operating in Russian, organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, financed by US Congress, or the BBC Russian service that have substantial followings in Russian by Russian citizens. It's been making the work of those companies much more difficult for years. Most Russians get their news from television, and there his control of television has meant that it paints a nonstop picture of Russia encircled by the West, and that Russia is surrounded by hostile Western forces, military forces, propaganda, information forces supposedly operated by the West. And his latest line has been that the culmination of Western plotting is to seize Ukraine and make it a member of NATO and use it to launch an attack on Russia. And that Ukraine is a corrupt country, it's run by Nazis, and that therefore it's a life and death issue for Russia, that it must seize Ukraine back and make it part of Russia as it was under the Russian Empire for a couple hundred years. In my opinion, Putin's real concern is not that Ukraine is going to be some kind of base for NATO. We don't really need Ukraine if we wanted to attack Russia, which we don't. His real concern is that Ukraine is a functioning democracy where many people speak Russian, where many people are Orthodox Christians like Russia. It's sort of an anti-Russia, that is to say, it's Russia without the oppression. And having a model like that on its border, showing how Russian-speaking Orthodox people can have a democratic country, is a very bad example because people might make unfavorable comparisons to his regime. Over the past couple of months, on the eve of the Ukraine invasion, he has pretty much chased the last independent Russian journalists out of the country. He's forced the big international broadcasters to suspend their operations inside Russia, just too dangerous. They've passed a new law saying that if you spread false information about activities of Russian forces, you can be sentenced to prison for up to 15 years. And of course, it's the authorities who decide what information is false. And he's cut off Facebook and Twitter. YouTube is probably next. There's very heavy surveillance of Russia's two social networks, with the goal of totally controlling what people know. If you look at Russian television, what you see is that the Russians are doing great in Ukraine, victories, Ukrainian people happy to see the Russians. You don't see blood, you don't see violence, you don't see explosions, you certainly don't see refugees or people, civilians killed by Russian forces. You'd think the Russian army is the Red Cross, looking at the way that they're presented by Russian state television. So, what do we do about this? For years, diplomats, U.S. diplomats, have wavered about expanding communication to Russia's people, and you could say this for many European countries as well. I mean, some have been afraid that engaging in messaging to Russia's population would provoke Putin into new steps to undermine Western societies, and others thought that Russians were so propagandized anyhow that no messaging that we put together would work. And many in the West also opposed anything that smacked of our own propaganda. Their feeling was that any attempt to assertively promote our views in opposition to the Putin regime would somehow become, just like being like them, that we don't do propaganda, and that we couldn't be trusted to do good propaganda, that we would eventually wind up doing disinformation, spreading false narratives just as bad as they are, et cetera, et cetera. So Western countries have done very, very little in this area. Now, because Putin prepared for this, and because he doesn't have any problems with the idea of propaganda, Russian citizens are now more and more locked into a situation where there's very little for them to see about the war but the sanitized and victorious view that official television presents. Some Russians have found ways to know what's going on, often from relatives in the military or relatives abroad that they talk to who are seeing the real story, or friends in Ukraine. And of that population, a number of people have been out there actually protesting the war in the streets and have been arrested for doing so. And protests are becoming more and more obvious. Just yesterday on Russian television, a woman appeared, a member of the television staff appeared on the main television news. She just ran onto the set with a big poster that she held behind the announcer that said, "No war, do not believe this is all propaganda that you're hearing." So that's pretty dramatic. So as you can see, information makes a difference. And that's why Putin's government has been so frantic to block out the facts about the war. And the West has this enormous opportunity, if we want to take it, to try to get the news through and influence the internal Russian information space. So that's what I'm working on. To summarize, what do we want to message Russians? What should the messages be? Who should be delivering those messages? And how might we penetrate all the defenses, the electronic cyber defenses that Russia has set up to try to block outside information from its own people? So that's basically my problem set right now.
Great, thank you, sir. So to the audience, from that discussion, if you want to start throwing questions in the chat, please feel free. But I've got a few to sort of lead off the question and answer part here. So in that problem set, the avenue of getting that information in seems to be like a big problem, right? Like we could have the best counter narrative in the world, but we can't get it to them. So what are some of the ways that you see that we can kind of penetrate the walls that the Putin government has been throwing up around its citizens to get that information in? Like, as you said, there's obviously some cracks in it because there are people protesting and they are getting bits and pieces of the information. But what can we do to either expand those cracks or sort of make our own to get our own messages in?
Well, one advantage that we have is that there's a substantial number of Russian citizens who really are curious about what's going on in Ukraine, and in general want to have contact with the outside world. And they've got friends on Facebook. It's not all about politics, but they can't get to Facebook, they can't get to Twitter, they can't get to all sorts of social networks, other sites that interest them. It's just increasingly oppressive. So even without our doing anything, they are doing some stuff. So VPNs are getting increasingly popular in Russia. And there's a little bit of an arms race there because Russians have made it illegal to use VPNs in certain ways, but they haven't been able to block all of them. And so there are ways that people can use a VPN to get out into the real internet. And so there's that. And when people do get information, they tend to spread it. Russia is a country that for decades basically ran on rumors, because in Soviet times too, information was severely restricted. So anything that you can get in or anything they can get out to is a is likely to get redistributed widely among the Russian people. In terms of what we can do, well, back in the day, during the Cold War, Western news outlets like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and so forth use shortwave radio, high-frequency radio. And that still works. It's a great technology. The problem is that very few Russians these days know what shortwave radio is or have the receivers for it. So that's the knock on shortwave. Email still works. So there are people outside Russia already, a lot of private actors and probably some government actors that are doing mass emails into Russians. And these can be text emails, these can be emails with audio clips or video clips. There are closed messaging groups on lesser known social networks that people can use and that we can get into, particularly if we have a certain population, a group of people that we want to stay in contact with. They haven't shut off the whole internet, so if we can use some social network or something under the radar, that helps. It's possible to transmit digital material by other means. You could transmit digital material by telephone, the old dial-up technology. If you've got someone at the other end in Russia who's willing to receive it and redistribute it, you can also transmit digital information by high-frequency radio, which is not a widely known technology, but one that's actually very simple. You can transmit it essentially to a cell phone with an app that will allow you to download it. You can, depending on how the situation evolves, you can smuggle in flash drives in different ways and count on people to distribute that. So it's a combination of push and pull. We can push certain things into Russia, and there is a part of the Russian population that will pull it, that is eager to have it, and will redistribute it at some risk to themselves, but they're willing to do it.
All right, so thank you. So say we figure out, we find a technology or technologies that lets us get a message in. I kind of have a two-part question here about, what would we send then at that point? What message would we, and I say we in a very expansive sense in terms of both official Western government arms as well as, Western non-government arms and organizations to get a narrative in. What do you think that narrative should be, and how does the West frame that narrative in a way that has some sort of credibility, that doesn't sort of automatically run into anti-Western antibodies that Putin has been trying to put into his own people for years and years and years now? And then second part of the question is, how effective do you think that the Ukrainian messaging has been to the Russian people? Because we've seen the both from those soldiers on the front lines all the way up to the top to President Zelensky directly addressing the Russian people in a number of different ways. In fact, I think it was yesterday, maybe my time offset is a little bit off, but it was yesterday or the day before, where President Zelensky had he's speaking to his people, but then he switched to Russian, speaking directly to the Russian soldiers, basically saying, like, you're probably going to die here, and why would you want to do that? How does that message have any credibility from him, as a non sort of European or non-American person? As you said, the Russian and Ukraine have very sort of close linguistic and cultural ties. But does that still resonate? Because he has still been identified by the Russian government as the enemy, as the other to go after in this campaign.
Yeah, I think he's pretty effective. Again, there's a question of how many people are able to see him, these messages that he does. But he is a native Russian speaker. That's really his first language. So it's hard to otherize Ukraine when its president is a native Russian speaker. It's hard to claim that Ukraine is run by Nazis when the president is Jewish. So these are some fundamental problems that Russian propaganda has to deal with. And so I think the Ukrainians are effective. Not only that, but They are very busy in um, in in sending out videos showing Russian destruction of civilian areas, showing POWs that have been captured by Ukraine, memes, all sorts of things that the Ukrainians are coming up with. Again, it's a question of penetration, but the information product that they're coming up with is pretty effective. I think you're right that there are anti-Western antibodies in the Russian population, and so if I were designing messages for Russians, they wouldn't be on the lines of the West is great, you should love America, that kind of thing. They need to be very practical, very true, very provable items. For example, that Russian soldiers are under fire now from Russian-speaking brethren who are fiercely loyal to Ukraine, and they're fighting for what they consider their country. And these are essentially your own people that you're killing. They just happen to be of a different nationality. It would be as if the United States were fighting Canada. I think a lot of Americans feel very close to Canadians, like they're our own people. We would not like the idea of leveling Canadian cities. There are, I think, another important message is the degree to which Russian soldiers are being captured, the degree to which they're being killed. There is a obvious corruption and incompetence among the Russian armed forces. These armed forces that have been given enormous amounts of money, and that Russian propaganda has been going on and on about how modernized they are and how amazing they are and how everybody's so well trained. Turns out not to be the case when it comes to putting a large mechanized army in the field. The Russians have been successful in different ways with air power in Syria and things like that. But when it comes to actually fielding an army on the ground, this is falling apart. Their logistics are very poor. Their communications are amazingly sloppy from an operational security standpoint. Lack of encryption. I mean, all sorts of amazing things you would think they would be beyond. So none of this is a question of opinion or trying to promote democracy. I mean, this is just fact about what's going on in Ukraine, and something that Russians eventually will hear from friends and relatives in the armed forces, and which will validate what we're telling them now. It's also true, it's just a fact, that Putin has turned almost the entire world against Russia. So if you're a Russian entrepreneur, or you're a cultural figure, or you're a tourist who wants to go abroad, develop your cultural skills or your business abroad, that's just closed off. The Kremlin has made the country ever more dependent on China, and China needs Russia a lot less than Russia needs China. So this is just another opportunity for Russia to become a colony of China, an economic colony, and eventually a political colony of China, because they have these huge needs. They have made sure to get rid of all their Western friends. So this just leaves them with the opportunity to become to pay tribute to China and give them resources, and let China essentially control Russia, because Russia will have no any other option. As I say, this is just all true. There's no need for us to generate disinformation about any of this, and it's just a question of us stating facts, which Russians are increasingly able to see are true. When their Visa and MasterCards don't work anymore, when McDonald's and KFC close down, when their trip abroad now is not going to happen, they can see that these narratives that we would share are true.
Great, thank you. So I'm starting to get some comments from the audience here, so I'm going to start going into those. The first one, it's more a comment than a question, but I want to sort of tie it to a question to explore, and that goes back to what you mentioned there about penetration, the different channels that are available. So Alex from my audience mentioned, one of the few info channels left open is Telegram, which, as I understand it, it's a Russian social media application. So, if you can maybe talk a little bit more about what do you see as the messaging going out over those remaining social media apps that the government has allowed to operate, but maybe also some of the impact on the population of losing access to those other ones. For example, you mentioned, Meta, Facebook, and Instagram have pulled back their services. And I think I was reading that Instagram in particular has a big impact on sort of small business, or what we would call, like, influencers who monetize the content they use on Instagram to make a living. Now that's gone. So what are some of the second order impacts of that potentially that maybe the Putin government hasn't thought about?
Yeah, that's very true. And the degree to which they thought about it, hard to know. It's clear they don't care. But I think that they probably do not have a full understanding of how integrated into life social networks are, and how many Russians, particularly younger ones, and by young, I mean, we're talking people 40 or 50, not people who are 15, how much they depend on them and how much they are a part of their life. So, yes, I think that this kind of thing just builds up resentment among the population. And the population understands perfectly well that the reason that all this is being blocked is that there is information out there which the government does not want them to have. That the government, just like Soviet times, considers that people are the property of the government, that they belong to the government. It is for the government to decide what they see and don't see, that they have no particular individual agency. And this is a position that I think is less and less popular among Russians. Russians have had a long opportunity now the Soviet Union ended in 1991, and ever since then they have had an opportunity pretty much unrestricted to access things from all over the world. So this is now whether they're going out on the international internet in order to get political commentary, or they're going out there to get pornography, whatever it is, they feel sort of as a matter of human right, they should be able to go on the internet wherever they want. So this is actually a big deal, and I think it's a bigger deal than the ruling political circles there realize. That's a very good point about Telegram. It's absolutely right. Telegram is a social network that was actually created by a Russian, but he now lives outside Russia and has been in a battle with Russian authorities trying to keep Telegram up. And Telegram is pretty well designed from a technical standpoint. The Russians have not been as successful in blocking Telegram as they have been in blocking some other social media. They tried to shut it down a couple of years ago, and it was a huge mess. They wound up knocking out all sorts of other internet services by mistake and trying to get all of Telegram's IP addresses. And they also found out that an awful lot of Russian officials use Telegram for their own communications. So that's one that they'll have particular trouble with.
Yeah, no, I certainly appreciate that. There are lots of unofficial back channels on the U.S. government and DoD side of apps that maybe we don't think people are using, but they're using it to share information. So going in now into sort of the more formal questions here from the chat. First one is from Major John Berman, who's actually our director for Center of Regional and Security Studies here at the Kulak Center at Marine Corps University. And this is interesting because this is sort of the flip side of the narrative of laying out the facts that we've been seeing on Russian television and messaging. How have Western and American media messaging, how is some of those messages, sort of the more pro-Putin messaging, been exploited and incorporated into domestic Russian propaganda efforts during this war?
You mean messaging, you mean they're quoting pro-Putin people abroad? Is that what the major's referring to?
Yeah, so I know that there have been some instances where official Russian supported state media, television channels, the ones that are left, have been, using things that people back in the West and in the United States have specifically been saying.
Yeah, sure.
Whether, yeah, and I can think of a few examples, but if you know some examples, if you can maybe explain how they've been using that and what that does, how that complicates, our own official messaging efforts to try and push back on Russia's narrative.
Yeah, well, this has been going on for a long time. Even in Soviet times, they would work very, very hard to get any kind of Westerner to say anything positive about Russia, the Soviet Union, and then pump that back to their own people. Because throughout the Soviet period, people knew that their media was censored and totally controlled by the authorities. So they would they discounted a lot that was there. But if the Russians could get somebody to from the West to say that Russia's right or Russia's great or something like that, that had great value because it tended to validate what the official propaganda was saying. When I was in Russia back in the day in the Soviet Union, they had a program on TV called the Soviet Union Through the Eyes of Foreign Visitors, and they would go and talk to foreign tourists, often American tourists, and Americans are very polite, and they would interview them for Russian TV, and they would say, so what do you think of your visit to Russia? And Americans would say things like, "Oh, it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful, and in the U.S. we have all these homeless people on the streets, but you don't, and we heard that medical care is free in Russia, it's not free in America, and we heard that everybody in Russia has a job, and lots of people in the United States are unemployed," which is sort of the way Americans are. They're polite. They like to be nice to people interviewing them. And they turn that around and play that for the Russian people. And the Russians might think that their propaganda was actually correct. In this situation that we're in now, the Russians have been looking very aggressively for any kind of Western person who will say something nice about, well, it's hard to say something nice about the invasion itself, but at least say something nice about Russia needing to assure its security, that the West really does threaten Russia. I saw reports that that Russian media have been encouraged to use clips of Tucker Carlson saying things supportive of the Russian regime or negative toward the U.S. government's policy toward Russia. So that counts for something. There's some pro-Russian members of European parliaments who there's pro-Russian. If you look hard enough, you'll find pro-Russian persons somewhere, anywhere, and then these people are sort of lionized by Russian media as if they were major figures in these countries, in these parliaments, and they're quoted extensively. So it does have some impact. It has had some impact for a long time, but I don't think that a few voices like that are likely to be decisive. I think Russians, above all, like everybody in the world, care about themselves. And it may well be that someone in the West says that Putin's great and that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is justified. The fact is that Russians are getting killed, and their ability to live normal lives is increasingly restricted. And that's probably more interesting to the average Russian than what some guy in parliament in another country says.
Great, thank you. So next question we have from Mark, asking, going back to your explanation of how the Kremlin's motivation, and it's part of its public narrative, well, some of the public narrative for its invasion, is tied to Ukraine's existence as a functioning liberal democracy, that is Russian speaking and shares an Orthodox faith. Asking if you could expand on this and maybe give some examples of how the Kremlin has messaged that motivation. And I think also with that as well, if you could, if you're able, expand a little bit on Russia and really the Putin government's relationship with the Orthodox Church. I know in a very sort of superficial level that there is a tight relationship there, and that I can't, not knowing much about the leaders of the Orthodox Church, I can't speak for that, but I know that Putin has used perceived support that they've given as part of his own narrative, that not only is this, helping out fellow ethnic Russians, but there's almost a religious war element to what he's doing. So maybe you could touch on that as well.
Yeah. Well, the Russians have indeed tried to otherize Ukrainians as much as possible. This is a problem for them, that a lot of Ukrainians are Russian speaking and they're Orthodox and I mean, some are Catholic, but they're still, Western Christians in one way or another. And they have tried very hard to convince the Russian population that either, yes, they're Russian and Orthodox, but they're also Nazis, or that they're Russian Orthodox, but they're under the control of Nazis and want our liberation. None of this is easy, and that's one of the reasons the Russian propaganda has actually had so much trouble with Ukraine. So, yeah, attempts to otherize the Ukrainians are something they're pursuing, but it's not the easiest thing. I mean, to say on the one hand, as they do, that we must incorporate Ukraine into Russia because there is no separate country, Ukraine. They are essentially Russians. They are our people. And at the same time, we have to blow them all up. There's a little cognitive dissonance there. Regarding the church in general, yes, the Russian authorities over the past decade or two, especially, have been trying very, very hard um, to make the Russian Orthodox Church a respected, important force inside Russia, which legitimizes the Putin government. That is to say, if you're Orthodox, you should be pro-Putin. They're all together. So after Putin was inaugurated at the beginning of his most recent presidential term, Russian television showed him going and being officially inaugurated in a Kremlin ceremony, and then immediately left the ceremony and went to a Russian church next to the Kremlin, where he met with didn't meet with, where he was essentially blessed by these bishops, archbishops, and the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and Putin kissed an icon, and as they do in the Orthodox Church, and all of that. So it was very clear that the church was blessing him, and he was affording his full support and authority to the church for the church's benefit. This is, of course, a far cry from the Soviet Union times when the church was banned essentially, but now they've decided that the church can be an ally. The religious feelings in Russia are hard to judge. I think, as in most countries, fewer people are very religious, at least are very active churchgoers than in the past. So there's probably a limit to what can be done. But I would say that in terms of Western messaging to Russia and to East European populations where the church does have Orthodox churches in other countries and Catholic churches in other countries do have some sway, that we too could use religious messaging. We tend not to. I think most US officials, most sort of non-government democracy activists are not, big on religion, but I think that it could be extremely effective. I think you could certainly make an argument that Jesus would not be pleased with what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And so, if they could use religion, we certainly could too. And I think we could, if you're a religious person, I think you could do it in very good conscience. I think Jesus would not be pleased with what they're doing in Ukraine. So um, uh, I don't think that religion should be an off limits um, topic for us to use in our messaging.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, sir, because I know some of the on the Western or American side, some of the people who've sort of demonstrated some sympathy with the Putin regime have held him up as somehow a defender of Western Christian civilization and what they're doing right now in Ukraine. If you didn't get the message in Aleppo or in Grozny, the message should be clear now that there's a definite contrast from what the Christian faiths generally talk about in terms of what you should do to your neighbor, for example. All right. So next question from Travis Reese. It's another kind of two-part question here. So first part is if the open source tools that are used to assess media and social media are less viable right now, given how the Putin government has closed off those networks, how capable are we of designing intel-driven information and influence operation without good measures or sort of feedback of sentiment and activity? And then what are some secondary methods of gathering such understanding for a viable narrative campaign?
Well, one way, of course, is to look at the degree to which Russians do try to reach the outside internet and what they're looking at. So there are all these VPNs. They terminate in Western countries. Maybe there's some way to see where people are going and what they're looking at. Organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or the BBC that have Russian services can see where their visitors are coming from. And if suddenly there's a huge surge, from Holland, for example, we know that there aren't very many Russian speakers in Holland. We know that there's some VPN that terminates in Holland that is bringing traffic from people inside Russia. I mean, the whole VPN structure can be understood. So that's one thing. I think there's also the question, and I pose as a question, not as an assertion, of the degree to which we really care, or whether it's strategically significant, what Russians think, as opposed to what Russians do. So you could have perfect opinion polling in Russia, and you could establish that 80% are against the war, perhaps. And then what? I mean, it doesn't take you anywhere. It's nice to know what people think, but if they're not doing anything, then what difference does it make? So I would think that one thing that Western operators ought to consider is, what do you want Russians to do? Can we ask them to do something that we could then measure? Obviously it's, you can try to encourage anti-war demonstrations, although there's sort of an ethical issue there. If you encourage people to go out in the streets and they all get shot down, do have some responsibility. But if it's a question of people, not going to work, or people or making certain kind of posters or symbols appear, or, get people to make stickers of some sort and put them up somewhere, then you have a way of establishing some kind of way where people can make their feelings known in a relatively safe way that maybe you can measure. So, maybe that kind of thing occurs to me. Again, there are all sorts of ethical and practical issues involved, but on the whole, I've always believed that actions are much more important than opinions.
Great. Yeah, that is a conundrum. I know that some on the in the West and the U.S. have expressed opinions about what they would want the Russian people to do. But there's definite ethical questions about that, as well as, if the Russian people did some of the things we're asking them to do, do we know the consequences of what those would be? Have we really thought out what might come from second order effects?
Of course, there's another angle to that, and that is, Russians are not robots. They will not automatically do whatever an outside actor asks them to do. I mean, they know the dangers in their country. And when I was a correspondent back in Soviet times in Russia, I would often interview dissidents and other sort of anti-regime figures, and I would sometimes say to them, I feel uncomfortable quoting you by name because you could get in trouble with the KGB. And some of them would say to me quite angrily, look, I'm Russian. I know about the KGB. I'm talking to you on the record. I want my name used because it affords me some protection. If my name is used on the Voice of America, then it makes it harder for the Russians to arrest me because it's likely to bring more bad publicity for them. So don't worry about me. You do your job. I'm telling you to quote me feel free to quote me. That's your responsibility. I'm running a risk. I know I'm running a risk. That's my business. This is my country. So there's that angle as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not so much a question as a comment, but I'm going to kind of turn it into a question because I think it's possibly a without precedent action going on. So we have Alex who's entered into the chat, and he mentioned a few other things about Telegram as well, brought that to our attention. So he's mentioning how Ukraine has established a call center that lets Russian relatives call and find out what's going on with their relatives who are in the Russian army, who've been either, killed or captured as prisoners of war. And he says there's a very high rate of calls going on. And I've seen some of the the videos of Russian POWs calling their mothers, there's probably some questions there about whether that's entirely in line with the laws of war, under the Geneva Conventions,
Absolutely.
which is an interesting sort of probably a larger discussion we could have. But also, I can't think of any precedent where you're able to have such direct connection with somebody on the battlefield to their families back home, taken prisoner. Like I on the friendly side, it's one thing. From my own deployments, I know eventually we set up the infrastructure where, on the friendly side, I could call back to my family, right, or FaceTime them or whatever. But there was never any sort of architecture set up for the enemy to be able to do that to their own families. So I think from your own knowledge, is there any precedent to doing this? And what are your thoughts on, well, we can talk about the Geneva Conventions as well, but as a way of influencing opinion very directly, like you get the mother on your side, like it's a very powerful person to get on your side. Well, what impact could this have, or is this already having on the Russian population? Because I personally can't imagine the impact on my family if I was magically calling from some cave in Afghanistan, right, saying, I've been captured and I don't know when I'm coming home.
Yeah. Well, we do have hostage videos that have happened in the Middle East where a Westerner will get captured and then the captors distribute a video of that person saying, I'm being treated well or whatever, or please, American aggression must stop so I can be set free. I mean, that exists. But these are not hostage videos. These are phone calls to and you hear the whole back and forth sometimes with their parents. It's very effective. Obviously, it's particularly effective because we're talking the same language here, literally the same Russian language. So that's effective. I should note that the Russians do this too, that there are videos on Russian television of Ukrainian soldiers who've been captured by the Russians calling their parents and saying how well they're being treated. So, this can go in both directions. But I think that the one factor that this plays into is the unpopularity in Russia of serving in the army. That many Russians try very hard to avoid conscription. And as a matter of fact, there's a new wave of new conscription season coming up in April, where a lot of Russians will be inducted into the army, will be drafted into the army, and there'll probably be even more resistance. But what's been going on for years is that Russians have paid bribes to not be conscripted. There's an organization of soldiers' mothers, which is quite large, that is trying to improve conditions for Russian soldiers who live in often very poor conditions and who are subject to great brutality. And that is something that's not often talked about in the West, but being inducted into the Russian army is a pretty awful thing. There is an institution called Dedushchina, which means basically the rule of the grandfathers. And what it means is that quite commonly new recruits into the Russian armed forces are hazed very brutally, beaten up. by the those who have been in there longer. And we're talking about broken bones and some of them killed and so forth. This is not just like slapping them around a little bit. And this is a very serious issue that even Russian media at times have written about. So I guess it's a lot worse than the Crucible. So this is what goes on, and there are many Russians who are just frantic to avoid the army. So this idea of this is not like a professional army where you join it if you want to join it and because you believe in the mission and you like the conditions or whatever the deal is. This is an army that drags you in and treats you sometimes in a very brutal way.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're coming up to about an hour here, and I don't have any other questions in the chat. So I'd like to, sir, thank you for your time here and give you a chance if you want to share any final thoughts or comments here before we say farewell to our audience.
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about all of this. We will see how this war ends, and that will have a huge impact on the information landscape going forward. So there'll be a lot to talk about in the future. And obviously, I'm pleased to help with Marine Corps University or any other educational or consultation or planning situations where I could possibly be helpful. That's what we do in the CyberOx, and I'm always at your service.
Our thanks to our audience for joining us for today's Brewcast with Thomas Kent. Just a reminder that we're going to continue looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine from a number of different angles in the coming days and weeks, beginning with our next Brewcast episode, which is coming tomorrow morning with Dr. Rita Konayev, Associate Director of Analysis and Research Fellow, Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University, who will be discussing Russia and urban warfare. And then just another reminder that on Friday, March 18th, we'll be having Arvind Verma of the InfraGard Partnership for Protection, and he is also part of the Marine Corps Cyber Auxiliary, who will join us for disinformation campaigns. We hope you can join us for the whole schedule, and please keep following us for upcoming episodes.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.